The noose swayed in a dry wind that carried the grit of judgment and the scent of parched earth. It was a pendulum counting down the last seconds of a life worth less than 2 loaves of bread. Below it, on the thirsty dust of Pale Bluff's town square, Luma Greer stood on the gallows, her hands bound with rope that bit into wrists already raw from labor. The wood was rough against her back, a final, uncaring embrace. Her gaze was not on the hangman, nor the grim-faced sheriff, nor the silent, accusing faces of the townsfolk who had once been her neighbors. Her eyes were fixed on the small cluster of humanity huddled near the base of the platform, 5 tremors of fear that were her world, her reason, her crime. Her children. Caleb, the eldest at 10, stood ramrod straight, his small face a mask of fury and terror, trying to shield the younger ones with his body. Elia, 8, with eyes as wide and dark as a night sky, held onto the twins, Finn and Samuel, who were 6 and didn't fully understand death, but knew the finality in their mother's eyes. And little Willow, just 4, her thumb jammed in her mouth, her sobs the only sound that truly pierced the oppressive silence. They wept, a sound like tearing fabric, and with each sob, a piece of Luma's soul ripped away. She had failed them. She had fought the drought, the sickness that took her husband, the gnawing hunger, and her own stubborn pride, but in the end, she had been reduced to a thief, and now she would be made an example. The law in Pale Bluff swung faster than mercy. Sheriff Brody, a man whose heart had long ago turned to jerky, cleared his throat. Luma Greer, you have been found guilty of theft, a crime against the good order of this township. The sentence is death by hanging. Have you any last words? Luma's throat was a desert. Words were a currency she could no longer afford. She tried to form their names, a final prayer, but only a dry rasp escaped. Her gaze fell to her children one last time, an apology she could not speak. Let it be quick. Let them not remember this forever. Let someone, anyone, have a sliver of kindness for them when she was gone. The hangman, his face hidden by a flour sack hood, moved to place the noose over her head. The coarse rope scraped her ear. Willow let out a wail that shattered the air, a pure, distilled agony that reached into the chest of every person there and squeezed. It was that sound that moved him. From the edge of the crowd, a man stepped forward. He was not a man of the town. He was a creature of the outlying mesas, his face a landscape of sun-baked lines and quiet sorrows. Reven Thorne. A name spoken in whispers, the reclusive rancher who owned the sprawling, empty acres to the north, a man hardened by a loss so profound it had scoured him hollow. He moved with a deliberation that drew every eye, his worn boots scuffing the dust. He did not look at the sheriff or the woman on the gallows. He looked at the 5 weeping children. He stopped before the platform, his shadow falling long and dark over them. From inside his coat, he pulled not a pistol, but a rolled-up deed, tied with a leather thong. He tossed it down. It landed in the dust with a soft thud, a sound that echoed louder than a gunshot in the charged silence. Sheriff Brody squinted. Thorne, what is the meaning of this? Reven's voice was rough, like stones grinding together, unused and unwelcome. That's the deed to my land, the rocking T, free and clear. He finally lifted his gaze, not to the sheriff, but past him, to Luma. He saw the rope burns already forming on her wrists, the stark terror in her eyes. He saw the ghosts of his own past in the hollows of her cheeks. Then his eyes dropped back to the children. I have no sons, he said, the words costing him more than the land ever could. But I've got land. A confused murmur rippled through the crowd. Sheriff Brody stepped down from the gallows, picking up the deed as if it might bite him. He unrolled it, his eyes scanning the familiar markings, the official stamps. It was real. All of it. 3,000 acres of hard-won earth, the best grazing land in the county. What are you proposing, Thorne? You can't buy a life. The law says a debt must be paid, Riven stated, his voice gaining a cold clarity. Her crime was 2 loaves of bread from Miller's store. What's the value? Miller, the portly store owner, puffed out his chest. 50 cents, and the principal of it. The township has spent more than that on the rope, Riven countered, his eyes like chips of flint. I'm not buying her life. I'm taking on her debt, all of it. He gestured with his chin toward the children. Her sentence is to be a mother, and you can't do that from the end of a rope. Let her go. She and the children become my charge, my responsibility. My land secures the bond. Any trouble from her, any cost she incurs to this town, you take the land. The proposition was insane. It was unheard of, to stake a fortune against the life of a common thief. Brody looked from the deed to Riven's unyielding face, then to the 5 children who had fallen silent, staring at this strange, grim savior. The law was about order, and a hanging was orderly. This was messy. But 3,000 acres was a powerful argument. It was more than the town could ever hope to possess. It was a guarantee against future trouble, a bond of immense weight. He saw the greed in the eyes of the town councilman standing nearby. "And what's your interest in this, Thorne?" Brody asked, his voice laced with suspicion. "You ain't kin." Riven's jaw tightened. A muscle jumped. He thought of the empty crib in his house, dusty and silent for 8 years. He thought of the small, unmarked grave next to his wife's on the hill behind his ranch. He thought of a silence so complete it had its own sound. "My interest is my own," he said, his voice dropping low. "I'm a man with an empty ranch. She's a woman with too many mouths to feed. It's a practical arrangement." He lied, and the lie tasted like ash. It wasn't practical. It was a desperate lurch toward something that might, for a moment, quiet the ghosts. Luma watched from above, dizzy, the world tilting. This man, this Riven Thorne, she knew of him only by reputation. A hermit. A man broken by the death of his wife and child. He never came to town unless he had to, and when he did, he spoke to no one. Why this? Why her? It felt like a crueler joke than the hanging itself, to be saved only to be indentured, her children now the property of a stranger. The rope around her neck suddenly felt less constricting than the invisible one he was offering. Sheriff Brody conferred with the councilman in a series of harsh whispers. Heads nodded. A deal was a deal, and this was the deal of a lifetime for Pale Bluff. Brody turned back, his face set. "The council agrees, on the condition that she is never to be seen within the town limits without your escort, Thorne. Her debt is transferred to you. They are your legal wards. Any transgression falls on you and on this deed." He held it up. "The law is satisfied." He gestured to the hangman who, with a disgruntled sigh, pulled the noose from Luma's neck. The rough hemp scraped her skin, leaving a raw red line, a brand of her salvation. Another deputy moved up the steps and cut the ropes on her wrists. The blood rushed back into her hands in a wave of pins and needles. She stumbled, her legs refusing to hold her, and she would have fallen had the deputy not caught her arm. He guided her down the steps, his touch rough, impatient. She stood on the dust, swaying, her gaze finding her children. Caleb ran to her, not embracing her, but standing before her like a small soldier, his eyes full of questions she couldn't answer. The others followed, clinging to her skirt, their small hands clutching the rough fabric. They were safe. The thought was a distant star, too far away to offer any real warmth. Riven Thorne did not smile. He offered no word of comfort. He simply turned to her, his face as impassive as the rock formations that gave his ranch its name. "Can you walk?" he asked. Luma nodded, though she wasn't sure it was true. Her body was a stranger to her, a vessel of shame and relief so potent it was paralyzing. "It's a long way," he said. He looked at the children, a brief, almost imperceptible flicker of something, doubt, regret, crossing his features. Then it was gone, replaced by the same hard mask. He turned and started walking north, out of the town, not looking back to see if they were following. He didn't have to. Where else could they go? Luma took a breath, the air still tasting of dust and death. She gathered her children, her hands trembling as she smoothed their hair, wiped their tears. "Come," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread. "We have to go." They followed him, a small, broken flock trailing a wolf who had, for reasons they could not fathom, decided to be their shepherd. The town of Pale Bluff watched them go, their whispers following them like vultures. They walked past the edge of town, past the last sad, weathered building, and onto the open plain. The sun beat down, promising no relief. Riventhorn's back was a broad, unreadable wall. He did not slow his pace. He did not offer to carry the weeping willow. He simply walked, and they stumbled after him, trading a wooden gallows for a wilderness of rock and silence, bound to a man whose grace felt as sharp and dangerous as any blade. The rope burn on Luma's neck throbbed with every beat of her heart, a constant reminder that she was no longer her own. The walk was a silent pilgrimage through purgatory. The sun climbed higher, a merciless eye in a bleached white sky. The ground was cracked and unforgiving, littered with stones that bruised the children's worn-out shoes. Reven set a hard, steady pace, the gait of a man accustomed to covering long distances alone. He seemed oblivious to the small, struggling caravan behind him, to the whimpers of Finn and Samuel, to the way Willow's legs eventually gave out, forcing Luma to hoist the child onto her hip, an act that sent a fresh wave of agony through her exhausted body. Luma's world had shrunk to the next step, and the one after that. The shock of her deliverance was curdling into a thick, heavy dread. She studied the man's back. His shirt was homespun, clean but faded. His shoulders were wide, set with a tension that never seemed to ease. He carried himself like a man perpetually braced for a blow. What kind of life had he purchased for them? A cage with thicker walls and a longer leash? The question swirled in her head, but her pride, that stubborn, ruinous pride, kept her silent. She would not beg him to slow down. She would not ask for water. She had accepted his charity. She would not also be a burden. Caleb, his hand fisted in the side of her dress, kept his eyes locked on Riven. His 10-year-old face was a storm of suspicion. This man had saved them, yes, but he had also claimed them. Caleb understood transactions. He had seen his father barter for seed, for medicine. He knew nothing was ever truly free. His mother now belonged to this man, and by extension so did they. He hated it. He hated the man's silence, his indifference. He hated the dust that caked his mother's face and the raw red mark on her neck. Finally, as the sun began its slow descent, painting the western mesas in hues of blood and rust, Reven stopped. He had led them to a small, shaded overhang of rock where a seep of water, barely a trickle, darkened the stone. Without a word, he unslung a canteen from his shoulder, filled it, and drank. Then he refilled it and held it out. Not to Luma, but to Caleb. The boy stared at the canteen, then up at Riven's face. It was the first time they had made direct eye contact. Riven's eyes were a pale, washed-out blue, the color of a winter sky. They held no warmth but no malice either, just a deep, abiding emptiness. Caleb hesitated, then took the canteen. He gave it to his mother first. Luma drank, the water so cool and sweet it was a shock. It was the first act of kindness, however small and impersonal, she had received all day. She gave each of the children a drink, her hands cupping their small heads. When she handed the empty canteen back to Reven, her fingers brushed his. His skin was rough, calloused. He pulled his hand back as if burned. He turned away, his face rigid, and refilled the canteen again for himself. The moment of contact, brief as it was, had been a trespass. They rested for a short while in the growing twilight. The silence was different here, away from the town. It was vast and ancient, broken only by the cry of a distant hawk and the tired breathing of the children. Luma watched Riven. He stood apart from them, staring out at the land that was now, somehow, their prison and their salvation. What did he see out there? Did he regret his impulsive bargain? Did he see the ghosts she'd heard whispers of? His wife, Elara Thorne, who they said had wasted away from grief after their infant son died of a fever. The ranch was supposed to be their legacy. Now, it was security on a thief and her 5 children. When he decided it was time to move again, he simply stood up and started walking. But this time, his pace was slower. He seemed to have finally acknowledged the 4 small pairs of legs struggling to keep up. As darkness fell, the landscape transformed. The familiar, sun-beaten shapes became monstrous silhouettes. The wind picked up, whispering through the sagebrush like lost souls. The twins began to cry in earnest, their fear a palpable thing. Luma's strength was gone. She stumbled, her ankle twisting on a loose rock. She went down hard, the impact jarring through her bones. Willow, still in her arms, let out a sharp cry of fright. Caleb and Elia rushed to her side, their small hands trying to pull her up. Riven stopped. He turned, a tall, dark shape against the star-dusted sky. For a long moment, he just stood there, watching them, a tableau of brokenness at his feet. Luma gritted her teeth, expecting a harsh word, an order to get up. She pushed herself onto her elbows, shame burning hotter than the pain in her ankle. Instead, he walked back. He reached down, not for her, but for Willow, who flinched away from him. His movements were stiff, unnatural, as if he had forgotten how to interact with a child. "Give her to me," he said, his voice flat. It was not a request. Luma hesitated, her protective instincts warring with her exhaustion. She looked at his face, barely visible in the gloom, and saw nothing to fear, but nothing to trust either. Yet, she could not carry the child another step. She relented, allowing him to lift Willow from her arms. The little girl began to sob, burying her face in the strange man's shoulder. Riven stood there awkwardly, holding the small, trembling body as if it were made of glass. He didn't pat her back or whisper comforting words. He just held her, a solid, unmoving post in the vast darkness. Then he looked at Luma. "Can you stand?" She nodded, pulling herself to her feet with Caleb's help. Her ankle screamed in protest, but she put weight on it, biting her lip to keep from crying out. He saw her wince. A sigh, barely audible, escaped his lips. It was the sound of a man accepting a burden he had chosen, but not truly wanted. He shifted Willow to one arm, a practiced motion that spoke of a distant, buried memory. He reached out his other hand. "Here." Luma stared at his open palm. It was a lifeline, a truce, an offer she was too broken to refuse. She placed her hand in his. His grip was firm, impersonal, his calloused skin a rough anchor in the swirling chaos of her emotions. He pulled her upright, steadying her, and so they walked the final mile to his ranch. A strange, silent man, carrying a weeping child, his other hand holding that of a condemned woman, with her remaining brood trailing behind them like ghosts. The lights of the ranch house appeared in the distance, a solitary flicker of yellow in an ocean of black. It wasn't a beacon of hope. It was just a place. An ending to a day that had destroyed one life and begun another, terrifyingly new one. The bargain had been struck in the light of day, but it was being sealed now, in the darkness, hand in hand, with the full, crushing weight of what they had all lost and what they were now bound to. The house was dark, except for the single lantern Riven had left burning in the window. Up close, it was larger than it looked from a distance, a long, low structure built of thick timber and river stone, solid and enduring like the man who had built it. It was a house made for a family, yet it radiated an aura of profound loneliness. As they approached, a dog barked, a deep, resonant sound, and then was silent at a low word from Riven. He led them not to the front door, but around to the back, into a kitchen. He released Luma's hand the moment they were inside, the absence of his touch leaving her feeling strangely untethered. He gently set a sleeping Willow down on a bench near the hearth, where the embers of a morning fire still glowed faintly. The other children huddled together near the door, their eyes wide as they took in the room. It was meticulously clean. The floor was swept, the cast-iron stove polished, the copper pots hanging from hooks gleaming in the lamplight. But it was the table that drew Luma's gaze and made her breath catch in her throat. It was a long, heavy trestle table, big enough to seat 10, and on it, at one end, sat a single wooden plate, a single cup, a single fork. The stark solitude of the setting screamed louder than any words. It was the landscape of his heart, made plain. Riven seemed to follow her gaze. A flicker of something, shame perhaps, or a fresh jab of pain, crossed his face before he turned away. He moved to the stove, his motions economical and precise. He stirred the embers, added kindling, and soon had a small fire going. He filled a kettle with water from a pump in the corner and set it on to heat. He did all of this without speaking, his silence a heavy blanket over the room. Luma finally found her voice, though it was little more than a whisper. "Mr. Thorne, She didn't know what to say. Thank you? I'm sorry? What words were there for a situation like this? He didn't turn around. "Name's Riven," he said, his back to her. "Best you get used to it." He moved to a large pantry, its shelves laden with sacks of flour, beans, and jars of preserves. An abundance of food that made Luma's stomach clench with a hunger so sharp it was painful. He came back with a loaf of dark, coarse bread and a knife. He sliced off 5 thick pieces and laid them on the table, pushing them toward the center. Then he took 5 small, mismatched bowls from a cupboard. One by one, he placed them on the table that was built for one. The sound of the pottery clinking against the wood was the sound of an invasion. 5 small bowls, a testament to the family he did not have, now cluttering the stark emptiness of his life. The water boiled. He poured it over dried herbs in a tin pot, the scent of mint and chamomile filling the air. He poured the weak tea into the bowls and pushed them forward with the bread. He did not get a bowl for himself. "Eat," he said. It was an order, not an invitation. The children looked to Luma. She nodded, her throat tight. She sat down at the vast, empty table, and the children followed suit, climbing onto the benches. Caleb sat beside her, his posture rigid. Elia sat on her other side, her small hand creeping into Luma's lap. The twins, Finn and Samuel, sat opposite, their faces smudged with dirt and tears, their eyes fixed on the bread. Luma picked up a piece. It was hard, crusted bread, but it was food. She broke it in half and gave a piece to Caleb. She took a small bite of her own. There was no salt in it. It was the plainest sustenance, bread shared without the covenant of salt, a communion of necessity, not fellowship. The children ate ravenously, dunking the hard crusts into the warm, sweet tea. They ate in silence, the only sounds their chewing and the crackle of the fire. Riven did not eat. He stood by the hearth, one hand resting on the stone mantelpiece, watching them. His face was a mask of shadows and firelight, unreadable. Luma could feel his gaze on her, on the children, a heavy, assessing weight. She looked down at her hands, at the angry red rope burns on her wrists. They were a brand, a permanent mark of her shame. She wondered if he was thinking of the price he had paid, a whole ranch for this ragged family. Was he already regretting it? When the children had finished, their bellies full for the first time in weeks, a deep, bone-weary exhaustion settled over them. Finn's head nodded, and he slumped against his brother, fast asleep. "There are rooms," Riven said, his voice startling her out of her stupor. "Upstairs. 2 of them. Empty." He lit another lantern and led the way out of the kitchen and up a narrow, steep staircase. The air upstairs was cold, still, and smelled of dust and cedar. He opened a door to a small room containing 2 narrow beds. "This'll do for the boys," he said. He opened another door across the hall to an identical room. "And this one for the girls." Luma looked at the rooms. They were Spartan, but clean. The beds had mattresses stuffed with straw and a single wool blanket folded at the foot of each. It was more than they'd had in months. Where will I sleep?" she asked, her voice faltering. The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Riven's jaw tightened. He did not look at her. He gestured to the room with the 2 beds for the girls. "There's space on the floor. I'll fetch another mattress." He turned to go, his meaning clear. She would be with her children, separate. The arrangement was about guardianship, not companionship. He returned a few moments later with a thin mattress and a blanket, which he dropped just inside the doorway without entering the room. He handed her the lantern. "The dog, Bear, sleeps by the stairs. He doesn't bite, but he'll bark if you try to leave." The words were a plain statement of fact, but they felt like the locking of a cell door. He retreated to the top of the stairs, then stopped. He seemed to be wrestling with something. The room at the end of the hall," he said, his voice strained. "Stay out of it." He didn't wait for a response, just turned and descended the stairs, his footsteps heavy on the wood, leaving them alone in the cold, silent upper floor. Luma got the children settled, Caleb, Finn, and Samuel in one room, Elia and Willow in the other. She laid her own mattress on the floor between the girls' beds, a meager fortress against the vast, unknown darkness of the house. She could hear the children's breathing deepen into the rhythm of sleep, a sound of pure innocence that twisted a knife in her gut. She had almost been taken from them. They had almost been left alone, and now they were here, in this strange man's house, their fate tied to his whims. She lay down, but sleep would not come. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the gallows, felt the phantom scrape of the noose on her neck. The rope burned there was a line of fire. She sat up, her body trembling. The house was utterly silent now, except for the low moan of the wind outside. She was trapped, a prisoner of a kindness she didn't understand. Driven by a restless anxiety, she slipped out of the room, careful not to wake the girls. The floorboards were cold beneath her bare feet. The moonlight slanted through a high window in the hall, illuminating a path of dust motes. And at the end of the hall, there was the door he had warned her away from, the forbidden room. Curiosity, or perhaps a deeper need to understand the man who now owned her life, pulled her forward. She crept to the door and listened. Silence. Slowly, carefully, she turned the handle. The latch clicked with an obscene loudness. She pushed the door open an inch and peered inside. The room was a nursery. It was bathed in moonlight, which fell upon a rocking chair, a small chest of drawers, and in the center of the room, a wooden crib. It was all covered in a fine layer of dust, a shrine to a memory too painful to disturb. This was his grief, his loss, laid bare. This was the empty space he had been trying to fill. And then she saw it. A small, impossible detail that made her heart stop. Nestled in the dusty blankets of the empty crib, a scrappy hen had made a nest. And in the center of the nest, gleaming like pearls in the moonlight, were 3 perfect white eggs. Life, stubborn and defiant, had found its way into the heart of death. It was a sign, a whisper of impossible grace in a place of sorrow. A floorboard creaked behind her. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. Riven stood at the other end of the hall, a silhouette against the faint light from downstairs. He had seen her. He had seen her trespass into the sanctuary of his pain. His face was in shadow, but she could feel the intensity of his gaze, a cold fire of anger and violation. For the first time since the gallows, she felt true, undiluted fear. She had not only broken his rule, she had desecrated his holy ground. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, a pillar of judgment in the darkness. The silence stretched, thin and brittle, until Luma thought it would shatter. He had seen her at the threshold of his deepest wound, and in that moment, she was more afraid of his silent, wounded fury than she had been of the hangman's rope. The eggs in the crib felt like a secret she had stolen, a hope she had no right to witness. He took a step forward, his shadow engulfing her, and Luma braced herself, certain that the fragile piece of their strange bargain was about to be irrevocably broken. His face emerged from the shadows, and it was not rage she saw there, but a shattering vulnerability, a pain so raw it was terrifying to behold. He looked past her, into the room, at the crib. His gaze was fixed on it, as if he could see not just the dusty wood, but the ghost of the child who was meant to lie there. The anger was for himself, for being caught with his soul so nakedly exposed. "I told you," he rasped, his voice thick with unshed grief. "I told you to stay out." "I'm sorry," Luma whispered, the words inadequate. "I didn't mean—" The door was— She trailed off, unable to explain the pull that had led her there. He finally tore his eyes from the room and looked at her. He saw the genuine fear in her face, the way she clutched her hands together, the faint, pale scar that was beginning to form on her neck from the rope. He saw a fellow survivor, another soul marked by loss. His anger, a shield he had carried for 8 years, wavered. "Get out," he said, but the words lacked their intended force. It was a plea, not a command, a plea to be left alone with his ghosts. Luma backed away slowly, pulling the door closed with a soft click, sealing the memory back inside its tomb. She fled back to the safety of her children's room, her heart hammering against her ribs. She slid down to the floor, her back against the door, and finally let the tears come. Not tears of fear or self-pity, but of a sudden, painful empathy for the hard, silent man downstairs. His act of grace had not been random. It had been a desperate attempt to build something, anything, on the foundations of his own ruin. And she and her children were the unasked-for, unprepared materials. The days that followed fell into a strange, brittle routine. Revan rose before the sun, his movements quiet and purposeful. He would tend to his stock, a small herd of hardy cattle and a dozen horses, and be gone for most of the day, a distant figure on the horizon. He left food on the kitchen table each morning: bread, a slab of bacon, a pitcher of milk from his single cow. He never joined them. The long table remained a testament to their division, 5 small bowls clustered at one end, a vast, empty expanse separating them from the place where he would eat his own solitary meal late at night. Luma, in turn, worked with a fierce, quiet determination. She was not a guest, and she would not be a charity case. She scrubbed the floors until the wood gleamed. She washed their clothes and rivans in a tub out back, her knuckles raw from the harsh soap. She tended the small, struggling vegetable garden near the house, coaxing life from the dry, reluctant soil. She cooked, leaving a hot meal on the stove for him each evening, a silent offering he never acknowledged but always ate. She was trying to pay a debt that had no price, to earn a grace that had been given, not sold. Her pride demanded it. The children, resilient as weeds, began to adapt. The terror of the gallows faded, replaced by the curiosity of their new surroundings. The twins, Finn and Samuel, discovered the creek that ran behind the house and spent hours chasing minnows. Alia, quiet and watchful, took to sketching in the dirt with a stick, her drawings filled with the shapes of the mesas and the hawk that circled overhead. Willow, who had clung to Luma's skirts for days, slowly began to venture out, her tentative steps exploring the edges of her new world. Only Caleb remained wary, a small, coiled spring of resentment. He watched Riven with an unblinking, accusatory gaze. He saw the man's strength, his capability, but interpreted it as a show of power. He saw his silence as disdain. One afternoon, Riven was repairing a section of corral fence. Caleb stood nearby, watching, his arms crossed. "My PA could build a fence twice as fast," Caleb said, his voice challenging. Riven didn't stop his work. He drove a post into the hard ground with a heavy mallet, the thud echoing in the still air. "Your PA ain't here," he said, his voice flat, without inflection. The words, though true, landed like a slap. Caleb's face flushed. "He's dead. He didn't run out on us." Riven stopped. He set the mallet down and turned to face the boy. He knelt, bringing himself down to Caleb's level. His pale eyes were steady. "I know he didn't," he said, his voice softer than Caleb had ever heard it. "Sickness takes good men. It ain't their fault, and it ain't yours." Caleb stared, taken aback by the unexpected gentleness. He had wanted a fight, an argument. He didn't know what to do with this quiet understanding. He kicked at a stone, his defiance crumbling. She didn't have to steal. We could have managed. The lie was thin, even to his own ears. He remembered the gnawing hunger, the sound of Willow crying for food in the night. Sometimes a managing ain't enough, Riven said simply. Sometimes the world don't give you a choice you can live with. He stood up, his knees cracking. He picked up the mallet. A man does what he has to for his family. He looked at Caleb, and for a fleeting second, the boy saw a flicker of something that looked like respect. Your mother's a strong woman. He went back to his work, and Caleb stood there, the anger inside him replaced by a confusing knot of emotions. The world wasn't as simple as he'd thought. This man wasn't the villain he'd wanted him to be. Luma, from the kitchen window, had seen the exchange. She saw the way Riven had knelt to speak to her son, the way Caleb's rigid posture had softened. A small, fragile seed of trust began to sprout in the barren ground of her heart. This man, for all his hardness, was not cruel. He was just broken. That evening, a storm rolled in, one of those violent, sudden prairie squalls that turned the sky black and unleashed a torrent of rain and hail. The wind howled around the house, rattling the windows. Luma gathered the children in the kitchen, the warmest room, and they watched the lightning flash across the sky. Suddenly, the back door burst open and Riven stumbled in, soaked to the bone, his face grim. He was carrying something wrapped in his coat. The roof of the lean-to gave way, he said, his teeth chattering slightly. One of the new calves was trapped. He laid his burden down near the fire. It was a tiny, shivering calf, its legs spindly and weak. Its mother had been killed by a falling beam. He began rubbing it down with a rough sack, trying to bring warmth back to its trembling body. The children crept closer, their fear of the storm forgotten, replaced by fascination. Is it okay? Elia asked, her voice a whisper. It's weak, Riven said, not looking up. Needs warmth and milk. Luma was already moving. She warmed a bowl of milk from their cow on the stove, testing it with her finger to make sure it wasn't too hot. She found a clean rag. She knelt beside Riven, dipping the rag in the milk and holding it to the calf's mouth. The little creature, barely alive, began to suckle feebly. They worked together in silence, their hands occasionally brushing, their focus entirely on the fragile life before them. The children watched, mesmerized. In the small, warm circle of firelight, with the storm raging outside, something shifted. They were not two separate entities, a creditor and his debtors. They were two people fighting for the same small, flickering flame of life. For the first time, the vast kitchen did not feel empty. It felt full. They saved the calf. By midnight, the storm had passed, and the little animal was sleeping peacefully in a bed of hay by the hearth. The children had long since been put to bed. Luma was about to retire herself when she saw Riven sitting at the long table, staring into the dying fire. He looked more weary than she had ever seen him, the lines on his face carved deep by exhaustion and memory. She hesitated, then walked to the stove and poured 2 cups of the chamomile tea she had brewed earlier. She placed 1 cup on the table in front of him. He looked up, his eyes wide with surprise. She sat down opposite him at the far end of the table, leaving the great wooden expanse between them, but it felt smaller tonight. "Thank you," she said softly, "for what you did, for the calf." He stared into his cup, his big calloused hands wrapped around it. "It's my calf," he grunted, the words a defense against her gratitude. "Still," she said, "it was a kind thing." They sat in silence for a long time. It was not the heavy, awkward silence of the first few days, but a more companionable quiet. "My son," Riven said suddenly, his voice so low she almost didn't hear it. "He was born during a storm like this. The roof leaked. Ilara, my wife, she said he was born to the sound of thunder, said he'd be strong." He took a shaky breath. He wasn't. The fever took him in 3 days. Luma's heart ached. The ghost of the nursery, the forbidden room, was here with them now, sitting at the table. She didn't offer empty platitudes or condolences. She knew from her own loss that they were useless. Instead, she spoke of her own ghost. "My husband John," she said, her voice steady. "He loved the smell of rain on dry earth. He used to say it was the smell of a promise. He died in the drought. Never got to smell it again." They were two people sharing scars in the dead of night, their confessions whispered across a wooden table that had once been a symbol of their separation. Revan looked up, and his eyes met hers across the distance. He saw not a thief, not a burden, but a woman who understood the language of loss. She saw not a grim recluse, but a man drowning in a grief so deep he had forgotten how to breathe. He nodded slowly. Acknowledgement. Understanding. He picked up his cup and drank his tea. When he was done, he stood up. "The calf will need feeding before dawn," he said, his voice back to its usual gruffness. He was rebuilding his walls, but Luma could now see the cracks in them. As he turned to leave, he paused. "You're a good mother, Luma," he said, without looking at her. Then he was gone, his footsteps receding up the stairs. Luma sat alone in the quiet kitchen, the warmth of the fire on her face. The rope burn on her neck no longer felt like a brand of shame. It was just a scar, a part of a story that was still being written. And for the first time since she'd stood on the gallows, she felt a flicker, not of hope, but of something far more fragile and real. The possibility of a future. The seasons began to turn, the relentless heat of summer giving way to the crisp, golden melancholy of autumn. The routine on the ranch solidified, the sharp edges of their cohabitation worn smooth by shared work and the quiet passage of time. The calf, named Storm by the children, grew strong, a boisterous symbol of their first shared victory. Revan still kept his distance, his grief a cloak he rarely took off, but the space between him and the family he had acquired seemed to shrink with each passing day. He started teaching Caleb how to track game and mend tack. He'd watch, from a distance, as Luma taught Alia how to identify edible plants, a small, proud smile occasionally touching his lips before he caught himself and turned away. One afternoon, Alia came to him, her small face serious. She held out a piece of smoothed bark on which she had drawn a picture with a piece of charcoal. It was a drawing of a man on a horse. In the man's hand was a rope, but it wasn't a hangman's noose. It was a wide, swirling loop, a lasso, reaching out towards a calf. "It's you," she said simply, and placed the drawing in his hand before running off to join the twins. Revan stared at the drawing for a long time. A rope, the symbol of death, of the law's cold verdict, transformed by a child's hand into a tool of life, of work, of the future. He slid the piece of bark into his pocket, the rough edges pressing against his palm. He felt the weight of it all day, a small, sharp reminder of how his life had been irrevocably changed. A rope, once meant to end a life, had instead lassoed him a family. The fragile piece they had built, however, was a world unto itself, an island in the hostile sea of Pale Bluff. The town had not forgotten. Their resentment, fueled by gossip and envy, had simmered all summer. Sheriff Brody had ridden out twice, his visits ostensibly to check on the arrangement, but really to search for any sign of trouble, any excuse to enforce the bond and claim the land for the town. He found none. The ranch was orderly, the children were fed, and Luma Greer was a phantom, never seen beyond the boundaries of the rocking T. This lack of chaos only seemed to anger the town more. It wasn't right, they whispered in Miller's store. A woman like that, a thief living on the best land in the county. And that Thorn, holing up with her and her brood. It was unnatural. The whispers finally reached the ears of Circuit Judge Morrison, a man who prided himself on ironclad law and moral rectitude. He was a man who saw the world in black and white, and the arrangement between Riven Thorn and Luma Greer was a smear of unacceptable gray. A formal complaint was lodged, signed by Miller the storekeeper and half the town council, questioning the legality of Riven's guardianship and the moral fitness of Luma's presence. A summons was issued. They were to appear before the judge in Pale Bluff in 1 week's time to determine the permanent fate of the children. The notice suggested they were likely to be declared wards of the state and sent to the orphanage in the next county, a place from which few children ever returned. The arrival of the deputy with the summons shattered their quiet world. Luma read the paper, her face draining of all color. The gallows had been a swift death. This was a slow, agonizing dissection. They were going to take her children. After everything, after all this work, this fragile peace, they were going to tear her family apart. The rope burn on her neck, now a faint white line, began to itch, a phantom sensation of the noose tightening once more. Riven took the paper from her trembling hands. He read it, his face hardening into a mask of cold fury. This was an attack not on Luma, but on him, on the choice he had made. The town was trying to undo his one act of grace, to drag him back into the sterile emptiness he had tried to escape. "They can't do this," Luma whispered, her voice ragged with panic. "They can't just take them." "They can try," Riven said, his voice a low growl. He crumpled the summons in his fist. "The law's a tool, can be used to build a house or burn one down. Depends on who's holding it." The week leading up to the hearing was a waking nightmare. A heavy, oppressive silence fell over the ranch, thicker and more terrifying than the silence of their first days together. Luma couldn't eat. She barely slept. She watched her children playing, their innocent laughter a knife in her heart, and saw them being herded onto a wagon, their faces tear-streaked, disappearing down a road she couldn't follow. Her pride, which had sustained her, crumbled into dust, replaced by a raw, primal fear. Riven became a storm cloud of contained violence. He worked relentlessly, his axe splitting firewood with ferocious, punishing blows, his hands mending fences with a white-knuckled tension. He was preparing for a fight, not of fists, but of wills. He disappeared into town one afternoon and came back with 2 packages. One contained a bolt of dark blue, sturdy cloth. The other held a new pair of shoes for each of the children. He handed the cloth to Luma. "For you," he said brusquely, "and the children. You'll not go before them in rags." It was not a gift of vanity, but of dignity. It was armor. Luma stayed up late each night by the fire, her needle flying, sewing a simple, respectable dress for herself and clean, mended shirts and trousers for the children. As she sewed, she felt a flicker of her old strength return. She was a mother. She would fight for her children. She would not let these people see her break. The morning of the hearing dawned cold and gray, the sky the color of dirty dishwater. The journey into town was a grim reversal of their first trek. They rode this time, Riven on his best horse, Luma and the younger children in the buckboard wagon, and Caleb riding a steady old mare beside them. They were a family, presenting a united front to the world that sought to destroy them. The town square, the scene of her near execution, was crowded. It seemed everyone in Pale Bluff had turned out for the spectacle. They parted as Riven led the wagon through, their faces a mixture of smugness, curiosity, and cold judgment. Luma kept her head high, her gaze fixed on the back of Riven's head, her hand holding Willow's tightly. The hearing was held in the saloon, the only building large enough to accommodate the crowd. The tables had been pushed aside, and Judge Morrison sat at a makeshift bench at the front, his face like a slab of granite. Sheriff Brody stood beside him, looking uncomfortable. Miller the storekeeper sat in the front row, his arms crossed over his round belly, a self-satisfied smirk on his face. The proceedings began. The judge read the complaint, his voice droning on about moral turpitude, improper guardianship, and the welfare of the children. He called Miller to testify, who painted Luma as a desperate, unrepentant thief and Riven as a strange, antisocial recluse who had no business raising children. Others testified, their words twisting the quiet life at the ranch into something sordid and unnatural. Luma sat beside Riven, her hands clenched in her lap, forcing herself to remain still, to not cry out as they tore her character to shreds. Riven was motionless, a statue of stone, his gaze fixed on the judge. The children, huddled on a bench behind them, were quiet and afraid. Finally, the judge looked at them. "Mr. Thorne," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "you are a bachelor, a man of known, solitary habits. You have no experience with children. You claim these 5 as your wards based on a bizarre and highly irregular bargain made at the foot of the gallows. A bargain to trade land for a convicted felon." "I traded land to secure a debt," Riven corrected him, his voice calm and steady, cutting through the thick air. "The town accepted. The town accepted the land as collateral, not as a bill of sale for a human being and her offspring," the judge snapped. "This is a court of law, not a cattle auction. I am asking what legal basis you have for this guardianship. Where are the papers, the official documents signed and sealed, that grant you custody of these children?" The judge leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with triumph. He had them. There were no papers. It had been a desperate, frontier bargain, not a legal transaction. "I demand you show this court proof of guardianship." The saloon was silent. Luma's heart sank. It was over. The law, with its cold, hard edges, would win. There was no paper, no document. There was only a deed thrown in the dust and a promise made in the shadow of death. Riven Thorne stood up. He did not look at the judge. He turned and looked at the children. He looked at Caleb, whose face was a mirror of his own defiance. He looked at Elia, who clutched the small, charcoal-stained piece of bark in her hand. He looked at the twins and at Willow, who was hiding her face in Luma's new blue dress. Then he turned back to the judge. His voice was not loud, but it filled the room, resonant with a power that had nothing to do with law books or legal papers. It was the power of a choice made and a life accepted. "They took my name," Riven said. "That's enough." The words hung in the air, simple, profound, and absolute. It wasn't about property or legal standing. It was about identity, about belonging. In that moment, he wasn't their guardian or their benefactor. He was their father in the only way that mattered. He had given them his name, the one thing he had left that held the memory of his own lost family, and they had taken it, filling the hollow spaces in his life. The judge stared, momentarily speechless. He had expected legal arguments, blustering, begging. He did not expect this raw declaration of truth. He looked at the hard face of the rancher, at the pale, determined face of the mother, and at the 5 children watching them, a silent, unshakable unit. He saw not a collection of wards and guardians, but a family forged in fire and desperation. He could send them to the orphanage, tear them apart based on a legal technicality. The law would be on his side. But for the first time in a long time, Judge Morrison felt the weight of something heavier than the law. He saw grace, unearned, but fiercely chosen. He slammed his gavel down, the sound making everyone jump. "The complaint is dismissed," he barked, his voice rough. "The arrangement stands. This court is adjourned." He stood and swept out of the saloon, his robes billowing behind him, not looking at anyone. A stunned silence fell over the room, followed by the grumbling of Miller and the disappointed murmurs of the townsfolk. They had been denied their final righteous victory. Sheriff Brody walked over to Riven. He looked tired. "You're a damn fool, Thorne," he said. But there was no heat in it. There was something that looked almost like admiration. "Don't make me regret this." Riven just nodded. He turned to Luma, who was staring at him, her eyes shining with tears she no longer tried to hide. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently guide the children toward the door. They walked out of the saloon and into the pale afternoon light, leaving the judgment of Pale Bluff behind them. The crowd parted for them again, but this time their silence was different. It was the silence of grudging respect, of seeing something they could not understand but could no longer deny. The ride home was quiet, but it was a new kind of quiet. It was the calm after a storm, the settled peace of a battle won. The sky was clearing in the west, and a sliver of golden sun broke through the clouds, lighting their way home. They were no longer just a collection of broken people clinging to each other for survival. They were the thorns. It was enough. That night, she set 6 places, and none were empty.